Hi, Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is James Rivington. And to help us talk about this fascinating printer, well, we have a very special guest, Jane Hampton Cook. Hi, Jane, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Now, I reached out to you, you said you'd be happy to come on, and when I asked you who you thought needed a little more attention, you brought up James Rivington. So, who was James Rivington, and what was he up to when the American Revolution started?
So James Rivington came to New York in 1760 when King George III became the king, and he set up a print shop and he was printing newspapers. And so he was printing both sides of the conflict, though he leaned a little bit loyalist. And in 1775, his print shop was attacked by the Sons of Liberty, and they hung him in effigy from Liberty Pole to Liberty Pole in New Jersey. And what he did, though, and this is why I picked him, is that he wrote this essay about freedom of the press. And he actually drew a picture of him hanging from a tree and on a woodcut and published it. And they didn't publish a lot of pictures back then. You only did that if you really had something to say. And he talked about how he believed that freedom of the press was the security of all the other liberties. That's how he had been raised as an Englishman. And so he really valued freedom of the press, and that he tried to present both sides. And then eventually his business was burned in November, I think, of that year, and he fled to England in 1776 January and was there for a good while. But when he came back in 1777, he was the king's official printer. He was on the payroll. And I saw some just fascinating things that he printed, and then some fascinating things that he apparently did later. So
So,
that's a little intro on James Rivington.
yeah, so he went to England, but then comes back to, what was it, New York he was in?
Yes, he came back to New York as the King George III's official printer in New York.
Right.
And of course, by that point, the British military controlled New York. It was their home base. It was their headquarters. So his audience was basically British soldiers. And so he was writing all these. He even made Saratoga sound good for the British until he got the capitulation papers and he had to print the fact that they lost. But
Right.
it was very propaganda oriented, and he wrote some terrible things about George Washington. And that's what struck me as so interesting about James Rivington is in August of 1781, he's writing that George Washington wants to be a dictator, that he's, under the thumb of the King of France, that he's running away from New York because he's all afraid of the new alliance that the English have with some principality in Germany. And it was just this real hit piece on
Right.
George Washington, which you kind of expected because it was a little bit more propaganda than it was news at this point. But we now know that while he wrote that hit piece, he was actually spying for Washington. And we know that he gave a signal book of the Royal Navy to one of George Washington's intelligence officers at the same time he ran this hit piece. So when you know that, you think, oh, he was just giving Washington cover. He was actually possibly protecting Washington at that point. And there's debate on when did he start spying for Washington? Was it 1779? Was it when he lost his income from the king, which was 1779? We don't really know, but we do know for sure that there's an intelligence report that he gave this book to the Patriots to help them, defeat the British Navy in August of 1781 as George Washington's taking his troops to Yorktown. And
Right.
so I think really, fascinating. I think, was he a loyalist or a spy? I think he was honestly both. That's kind of my assessment is at the beginning, he was a loyalist, but by the end, he had definitely helped the cause. And maybe he saw the writing on the wall, or maybe he, at heart, really wanted to have that freedom of the press that he had talked about in 1775
Right.
and
Well,
didn't want to go back to England. I don't know. But he did not go back to England at the war's end. And that's another part of his story that's really fascinating.
yeah, he sticks around in America, and it's funny because when you say that, you know, I'm often reminded that the Patriots were fighting for what they consider their rights as Englishmen.
Right.
So the fact that Rivington considered this right of free press so important, and I mean, a few years later, it ends up right in the Constitution, or as an amendment, so to speak.
Right. Exactly. That becomes part of the First Amendment.
Yeah,
And
and I
when
found
and when the British evacuated New York at the end of the war, when we had this peace treaty, and George Washington and his army come into New York, um, he sends a group of soldiers over to Rivington's press, and they stand guard because they are protecting Rivington. And the Rivington had such a reputation throughout all of the 13 colonies. People hated him. The other publishers who were patriots, they all took digs at him throughout the war because they thought he was such a propagandist. And so after the war, this story was published in other newspapers that Washington had sent his troops to protect Rivington. And so then there was this whisper campaign of, oh, maybe there's something we don't know. And so there was this speculation that maybe he had actually been helpful to the cause. And, it looks like George Washington obviously was protecting him, but he was also kind of giving Rivington his freedom. Hey, you can do what you want now. I'm protecting you, and you can stay, or, you can go if you want. And Rivington chose to stay. And he did try to run him for newspaper for a couple of years. It just didn't ever take off. And I think that's probably because his reputation had been so loyalist leaning before the war. People maybe didn't take him seriously. So he ended up becoming more of if he had been a Starbucks before, where his newspapers were at his coffee house, he became a Barnes and Noble,
right.
because he sold books, he sold things.
Right.
And that's how we were living.
Well, because his audience were the soldiers, and they left.
Exactly. And so he didn't really make his living as a newspaper guy as much as he did just as a small business owner selling things after the war. But and Washington referred to him while he was president a couple times. He asked someone to ask him a question, but it does not appear that they had much of a relationship beyond the war. And some of that was that Rivington's sons were still on the payroll getting a pension from the British military. So some of it was he maybe needed to keep that still kind of quiet so his sons would still get their pension. So
that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I should have probably noted off the top that this character is actually demonstrated in the TV show Turn, the fairly famous show. I've discussed many times that there are some liberties taken in that show when it comes to the history, as to be expected. But from what you're telling me, a lot of it seems to sound pretty accurate. I'm not sure if Washington actually went and hung out with him like he does in the show.
Exactly. That was for great dramatic effect.
Right.
But I think what we do know factually is that he did give the British Royal Navy signal book to the Patriots in August of 1781, and his name does appear in Washington's code book. He has a number assigned to him, but also some other British generals and other officers do too, and they probably weren't really spying. So were they given a number because they needed to refer to them, but they weren't on their side? So they don't know. I think that's why they don't know, which is why Turn could take some of the liberties that it did, because you could interpret it, couple different ways.
Right, so. Exactly. But it is interesting that for a spy show that this particular spy doesn't seem to have been given credit like that. Although, as viewers of this show know, neither did Austin Rowe, who is from my hometown and is the only founder from Patriot, New York. So,
yeah.
Jane,
well, and I loved Turn. I enjoyed that show very much, and it was great. So.
Oh, absolutely. And we expect them to take some liberties with historical things like that. Jane, thank you so much for being here. You make sure you find another founder and come right back to us as soon as you have the time.
Okay, I will do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, founder fans, again, big thanks to Jane Hampton Cook for what a great interview. Make sure you hit like and subscribe. And down in the description, I have links to both Jane's website and directly to her Amazon page. She's written nearly 1,000 books about all sorts of pieces of American history, and many about early families who helped build this very nation. So thank you again to Jane, and thank you for watching. We'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.